How was the gospel preserved during the Middle Ages? Throughout the centuries, God has preserved His Word and has raised up men and women for the task, even during the Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages, because of a perceived lack of knowledge. During the time the truth of the gospel was available, it is true that the Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire were at the height of their power, and a common language Bible was being suppressed. However, even then, God's people were active. God's hand is never shortened that it cannot save. Isaiah 59:1. His truth was marching on. The church had already survived much persecution under various Roman empires, including the great persecution under Dionysian between 308 and 313 AD. Constantine put an end to the persecution after he became emperor, and Christianity was eventually made the state religion of Rome. As Rome began consolidating its power ever the church, there were dissenters who refused to acknowledge the Bishop of Rome as their head. One such dissenter was the North African Bishop Dionysius. He stood against Rome's understanding of the sacraments and infant baptism. The non-Dionysius were condemned by the churches in Europe, but they continued to be a light for the gospel of grace in the days of Constantine. Other men who fought for truth against early heresies were Bishops Alexander and Lethius. Later, the gospel began to be preached as far as Ireland from 432 AD by Patrick. The principle was also translated into Latin, and the gospel spread throughout Europe. The Middle Ages, which lasted from about the 5th to the 15th century, was dominated in Europe by the Holy Roman Empire. This was the time of the Crusades, the Great Schism, the Inquisition, and the iron rule of the Roman Catholic Church. Throughout this difficult time, God has witnessed to the truth. When infant baptism was introduced by the Church of Rome, various churches dissented and denounced the practice in the 11th and 12th centuries. The Petrobrusians rejected infant baptisms. They became known as Anabaptists. The rebaptizing believers who had been baptized as infants, maintaining that baptism is only valid if it was a conscious act of faith by the believer. The Anabaptists survived intense persecution and still exist today. From the Anabaptists, the English Baptists came to pronounce prominence in the mid-1600s. A group called the Waldensians was started in 1170 in Lyons, France, by a wealthy man named Valdres Peter Waldo. He valued poverty as the basis for Christian life and the necessity for all Christians to preach the gospel. The Waldens continued to expand out, became increasingly estranged from the Roman Church over their doctrine. In 1184, a papal bull was issued against them. Other reform groups existing believe the Protestant Reformation were the Novatians, the Albigenses, the Petrobrusians, the Pelagians, the Cathan, the Patrians, the Lollards, and more. Long before Martin Luther posted the 85 Theses on the door in Castle Church in Wittenberg in 1517, there were men who had stood up for the Reform and the true gospel. Among them were John Wycliffe, an English theologian, an Oxford professor who was condemned as a heretic in 1415 for teachings that the common people should have access to the Bible. John Hus, a priest from Bohemia, who was burned at the stake in 1415 for his opposition to the Church of Rome, and that an Italian Trier, who was hanged and burned in 1498. During the 18th century, other godly men stood in opposition to the Church of Rome. Jacob Hutler, founder of the Haltrians, John Knox of Scotland, William Tyndale, martyred for translating the New Testament into English, John Calvin of France, Eutyches of Switzerland, and the English reformers Cranmer, Latimer, and Ridley, all burned at the stake. God has had a faithful remnant in every age. In the time before the flood, Noah found grace in God's eyes. During the time of the Judges, there were still faithful men in Gideon, Barak, and Boaz, and faithful women like Hannah, Deborah, Ruth. During the reign of Ahab and Jezebel, there were 7,000 people who stood firm against Baal worship. 1 Kings 19:18. Just as God has raised up unfaithful men and women in biblical times and the outworking of his divine plan, so he raised up faithful men and women during the Middle Ages. They were all sinners, flawed and imperfect characters, but God took what was weak and imperfect and turned them to his glory. Those faithful Christians were used by God to contend earnestly for the truth that was once for delivered to the saints. Jude 1:3. In spite of all the conflicts, schisms, and bloodshed that accompanied the growth of the church up to and beyond the Reformation, the gospel messages have been preserved. What does it mean that heaven and earth will pass away? The Bible constantly warns us this world will not last forever. Heaven and earth will pass away. Jesus said in Matthew 24:35. His statement was in the correct context of end times prophecies and the eternal nature of Jesus' words. My words will never pass away. This means that trusting Jesus is wiser than trusting anything in this world. Jesus also refers to the passing away of heaven and earth in Matthew 5:18 and Revelation 21:1. John writes of a new heaven and a new earth and the eternal state, having seen that the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Isaiah 65:17 and 2 Peter 3:13. To pass away is to disappear or be no more. This refers to the physical heaven and earth, the material world and all it contains, but not the spirits, souls of the inhabitants in those places. Scripture is clear that people will outlast the current material universe, some in a state of eternal bliss and some in a state of eternal misery, and that the current universe will be replaced by another that will never know the condemnation of sin. The method of this world's destruction is revealed in 2 Peter 3:11-12. The day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire. That day will bring about the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt in the heat. In Noah's day, the world was destroyed with fire, water, but God promised to send no more global floods. Genesis 9:11. In the day of the Lord, the universe will be destroyed by fire. The prophet Isaiah foretold the passing away of heaven and earth too. All the stars in the sky will be dissolved, and the heavens rolled up like a scroll. All the starry hosts will fall like withered leaves from the vine, like shriveled figs from the fig tree. Isaiah 34:4. The Lord assures his people that even as the heaven and the earth pass away, his salvation is secure. The heavens will vanish like smoke, the earth will wear out like a garment, and its inhabitants will die like flies, but my salvation will last forever. My righteousness will never fail. Isaiah 51:6. Knowing that heaven and earth will pass away gives us perspective in life. This world is not our home. We are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. 2 Peter 3:13. Jesus tells us to have the proper priorities. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Matthew 6:19-20. And Peter, after reminding us of the temporary nature of this world, says, Dear friends, since you are looking forward to this, make every effort to be found spotless, blameless, and at peace with him. 2 Peter 3:14.